Welcome. We're live.
We're live. Welcome.
It's sweater time.
Welcome to the This Is Not
It's
Therapy
June 3rd.
Hour. I am the disembodied voice of Brandon Tessers.
And I'm Caitlin.
I'll be sitting down in just a moment.
I love that phrase. I'm going to start saying that to people even when they can see me. I'm the disembodied voice
That
of
won't
Caitlin.
that won't make a lot of sense.
I know.
They can see you. We are both licensed therapists, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. It is just an open conversation. We're just here for an hour or so, chatting with each other and with all of you about whatever. And with every conversation, we'll be just talking and responding to each other and keeping in mind who you are, or at least our ideas of who you all might be, who would be here and watching, and what would they be interested in, and how are they likely to interpret things. For those of you who are willing and able to participate in the chat, we appreciate that, because then we have a lot more information to go on as we're trying to determine who you are and what you might be interested in and how you might interpret things. We work with a practice called Effective Artistry. The office is located in Northbrook, Illinois. We provide therapy for individual, couples, and families. For people in the state of Illinois, we also work with a couple executive functioning coaches who can work with people all over the world via the internet. One of the reasons this is not therapy, one of the many, is that it is public. So keep that in mind as you're participating in the chat. And don't worry about keeping on topic or anything like that. A, we don't really do that anyway. But B, that's not the point of this. We will talk about whatever so that we're not just sitting here silently. But for those of you who are here, this is, Caitlin and I talk to each other a lot outside of this. This is the opportunity we have to talk with you all. We'd rather know what you're interested in and go in that direction.
Definitely.
Regardless of whether it matches what we're already discussing or not.
And it's fun to hear from people.
Sure. I know the layout is slightly different. We had last week on Thursday, for the first time, Sarah and Marie, the executive functioning coaches with whom we work, we're running a co-working group through this stream. And it looks like had slightly different settings, and I didn't see that until we were launching and don't know exactly how to turn it back. So we might just roll with this big blue border today.
Yeah.
Because I'm not sure
So
how to change. Oh, wait, maybe.
Oh.
No.
Hmm.
Well, whatever. No. Oh, we can add music and stuff? Just in case that was going, I just turned it off. Anyway, we'll figure it out. But right now, we'll just have a blue border today.
And I did save the working session on Twitch, so if anyone wants to check it out, they can.
Yeah, it sounds like they had a good time and it was effective for them and for the people that, commented.
Sarah said she got so much done, like in all bold, like so much. So.
Well, there's a reason that people do things like body doubling and co-working groups. And it is a lot. There's a lot about the structure of it that does make it more likely that people will have success doing things of a certain nature during that time. So it worked well for them. I think they're planning on doing some more, but I'll wait until I know for sure and know about like days and times before saying anything definitive.
Yeah.
But yeah, here we are doing our thing, which is just an open
Is there a way
conversation.
to change it to see the comments?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Comments. How are you?
I'm good. I did a little tally through my whole day. It's all good.
Well, I think earlier I had asked, because you had asked how's my day been, and I asked you how yours was, and then I've just now said how are you?
Moment. How did I?
Well, no, not necessarily. Honestly, I was having a conversation about this with Amy, our clinical director, last week. That like with greetings in particular, there is a vast array of what most people would identify as like meaningless variations. The difference between how are you, how have you been, how you doing, how have you been doing, how are things going, like, because they mostly serve the same purpose. A lot of greetings generally are just expressing like trying to make you aware of my presence and acknowledge that I am aware of your presence and invite or prompt some conversation, right? And so people mostly just treat greetings that way. And then on the flip side, whenever people like delve into it more deeply than that, then they tend to get overly literal about like, oh, how are you means in this moment, how are you, versus how you doing means, you know, like, but these things don't tend to be literal. They tend to be just ways of stating like acknowledging your presence, making sure you're aware of mine, as well as indicating an openness or a desire to like communicate with you in this moment. Every once in a while I'll hear people complain about like, everyone says, how are you? And everyone just says good or fine, and nobody gives real answers. And I understand that complaint certainly, but that's mostly because it's the equivalent of saying like hi and hi back, you know, like it's just the function of that communication. So in other words, no, it's not like there's a correct way to interpret how are you. It's just, it's a transition phrase to like, now I'm inviting conversation with you.
How are you, Brandon?
I'm good, which is also why people mostly say I'm good, because it's the expected response. It's the response that is, I acknowledge your presence and that I am aware of it and indicate a willingness to participate in conversation with you. Next step now, please. You know, like,
I would have loved to internalize this at like 12 years old. Because my whole life people have asked me and I'll pause and be like, good, or like, okay.
Well, of course, sometimes people do mean it in that way. Like, it can be confused. Sometimes when someone's saying, how are you? Although usually they'll emphasize the are. Like, how are you? As opposed to like, how are you?
Yeah.
How are you? Tends to indicate like, no, I'm actually interested. I mean this thing literally.
Yeah.
Anyway. When I was younger, so I always enjoyed acting. My undergraduate major is in acting, but I acted like in middle school and high school, just in like, you know, as people do in the school stuff and whatever for the most part. Did a little bit outside of school in high school, but not much. And I remember when I was 17, people asking me, because I got good feedback on my performances. You know, like generally the response, you know, you don't go on to study acting at college if, or it's unlikely to do that if you're not getting responses from people like, oh, wow, you're so talented and whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And so some other people would ask me, like other kids, especially my age, who are also interested in acting, would ask me about like what am I doing or my thoughts on acting or whatever. I don't know why this popped into my head recently, but I've been thinking about this because my response back then dovetails so much with what I do and say and think now.
Ooh, little Brandon.
Right. Well, what I said was, to me, acting was, I'm going to try and use the language I remember using back then, not translating it through the language I would use now. What I said back then was, to me, it's like you have a certain prescribed list of responses to things, right? Like all people do. That if someone says hello, I'll say hello. If someone says hey, I'll say what's up or whatever. And of course it matters. There's a lot more context than just what the other person says, who they are and what's our relationship and what's around us and blah, blah, blah. But that to me, acting was about adding the response that you are written to give, like the line and the blocking, the thing that you're supposed to do, was a matter of adding that to that list of potential responses to stimuli. And connecting it as a response to the stimuli that you're getting in the show. So like when someone says to me in real life, I don't know, how are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
One of my potential responses is, I'm good. And then you take the circumstances of the show, whatever you're working on.
Mm-hmm.
I did mostly stage acting, so a lot of rehearsal and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
You take the circumstances of the show and be like, okay, when somebody just tells me that they murdered my wife, then I respond by, and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I, at that point or now, could like identify exactly the mechanism of how do you do that. But that to me was the intellectual idea, is that we all respond to things in particular ways based on a particular context of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a matter of like learning how to respond to the things that are happening in the show in the way that you're supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has these internal scripts, right? Like if someone says, how are you? There's a limited number of ways that I'll respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not infinite. If someone says, how are you? I'm not going to say giraffes are tall or whatever, right? So you're just expanding out that list every time you respond in some novel way.
Yeah. I was thinking about how I would maybe call that character development, and then I was thinking about imagining different versions of your future self and how you would respond in a future you to different stimuli with a you that, I don't know, you enjoy more.
Well, hello. Hi, Dad. I'm glad you're
I am
happy.
happy.
I am. I'm glad he's happy.
Oh no, I'm glad he's happy too. Yeah. And I was
So okay.
Yeah, so I was thinking, because I recently, something happened to me that was really positive, and the behavior, what I could track it came from, is one day I thought to myself, okay, if I could get whatever I wanted in the future as an artist, what would it be and what would it look like? And then I was like, I thought of a person to reach out to. And then I was like, okay, what would a confident version of myself say in this email? And then I wrote a confident version email. And then it all worked out. So that was that was the specific thing I was thinking, is like, or like that person wouldn't say like negative things about themselves to other people.
Yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is a specific technique that you might use to accomplish the purpose, right? So
Mm-hmm.
at first you said that sounds like character development,
Mm-hmm.
which in the world of acting would generally also be referring to like a specific technique that you would use, because character development is a set of actions. Mm-hmm. But in this case, you're just labeling the thing in a certain way. And then the second thing you said was like imagining yourself in those contexts, which would be a technique that you would use, a strategy you would use to attempt to accomplish what I'm saying. Where I'm just talking about what I think of as like what it is that you're aiming at, not necessarily how you get there. And then you're talking about things that you can do to get there, which is great.
Wow.
But just distinguishing the two things. And it is great. We often will talk about what you're referring to as acting as if.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who I mean when I say we often will talk about. It is sometimes referred to as acting as if, right? Like act as if you are confident. Then what would you do? Don't worry about whether you are. Just act as though you are. And it's a great strategy for a lot of things for people to like kind of attempt to bypass. It's context dependent, right? But there are times where trying to get yourself to think or feel differently is very difficult, but getting yourself to behave the way you would behave if you thought or felt differently is doable. And so you can kind of skip all that and go to that. And then it works the other direction too, right? Like the way you behave impacts how you think and how you feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's great. I'm glad it worked well for you.
Thank you.
Obviously, there are times when it doesn't work, right? When someone's like, act as if you're confident. Well, how would I act if I'm confident?
Yeah, I was going to give some sort of caveat about how it's not the only road to things or whatever.
Yeah, but it's a good exercise. Yeah. No, I'm just going to start I was going to transition into AI, but I don't know. Doesn't
I've
matter.
been wanting to talk to you about AI. I was
What do you
thinking
want to
about
talk
it this
about
morning.
AI?
Just what you think about it.
Just
Tell me
just
everything,
broadly?
Brandon. Yeah.
That is too broad. I don't know.
What do you think the major impact AI will have on society in the next year?
In the next year?
Yeah.
Minimal?
How do you want to use AI in your life, Brandon Bridge Tessers? Is that more specific?
What do you, rather than just trying to prompt me to say interesting things, like tell me what you're thinking or ask what you're actually curious about.
The society thing. Yeah.
So what are your thoughts then? You've been thinking about how it would impact society. What are your thoughts?
Oh, I don't have an opinion or like an official prediction, but I hear people essentially in two camps. It's really great, or it's like a virus that will slowly take over everything, and then human beings will just like lose control of everything. I feel like there's either people
What
who
do
are
you
like,
think?
I haven't thought about it enough to.
Oh, I just assume you've been thinking. I don't mean like.
Oh.
I mean, what are your thoughts about this? Not as in like, what do you predict will be the thing that happens?
Oh, okay. My thoughts are that we're at a turning point where the road forks into two paths, and I hope we go into the path of how can this be really advantageous for human beings, and that it could make things much better. And I think about getting rid of like, for example, the amount of time doctors spend taking notes. And I was like, that's great. It could give them more time with patients. But then I thought, oh, but would there be a backlash 3 years later where insurance companies say now you have to see 50 patients in a day instead of 25 because now you don't have to spend time taking notes? And then I thought about like different forms of technology that have increased productivity, but then there's been like a backlash where it's like, well, now we expect you to be twice as productive.
And what's the other? You said you're hoping it goes down one path. Is that at the end there you were talking about the path you're worried about, that it does make everything better and more efficient, but then people just ramp up expectations? Or is there a different other path?
That's one path. The other path would be, I actually try to not think about it much, but something about it goes really bad.
Like how? It doesn't have to be more specific thoughts, but
yeah, I try to not go down the rabbit hole. So yeah.
Well, now I want to talk about going down the rabbit hole. And
I would love that, honestly.
Okay, well, all right. I'll say I'm not worried about AI. I do have lots of thoughts, but I'm not worried about it.
Does that mean you don't predict that something bad will happen? Is that what worry would be?
Well, I
in
mean,
this
that's
situation?
a broad category. Something bad will happen. But I don't worry about like AI taking over everything and destroying humanity or anything like that.
Okay.
Now I'm more interested in the rabbit hole. Because
I'm really interested.
That's a common strategy that people will use, right? That like, if I'm thinking about something and thinking about that is distressing to me, then I will identify, not all the time, but sometimes I'll identify thinking about that as a bad thing to do because I'm just making myself feel bad. So now I'm trying to get myself to not think about it.
Yeah.
Which, to the extent that that works, and it can work depending on what's going on, but I do think it's helpful for people to know you cannot make yourself not think about something. Any attempt to not think about something is thinking about, like, don't think about X is a thought about X, right? To think that you shouldn't think something requires that you are thinking about that thing in order to think that you know. So to do that, and it can be helpful, but to do that is to focus on, well, what do I want to be thinking about or paying attention to instead? Because we can get ourselves to pay more attention to things, think more about things, and it's finite resources. So if we're thinking so much about this, like other stuff gets bumped. So if you get into a pattern of like, I need to stop thinking about this, you want to transition that very quickly into, what do I want to think about instead? If you don't, if you notice yourself getting into a place where you're just thinking, I shouldn't think about this, pretty quickly you'll get stuck in a loop
Mm-hmm.
where all you're going to think is just, why am I thinking about this? I should stop thinking about this. What's wrong with me? Why am I thinking about this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And it gets worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
So try and transition into, what do I want to be paying attention to?
Mm-hmm.
And then I would also say that there are times where that's not a good strategy, regardless of whether you can do it or not.
Yeah.
That it's not something that is a good idea to do. And I generally would identify that as like, if you're anxious or afraid or nervous about something, depending on the context, like sometimes there's nothing you can do about the thing. Your ability to influence that outcome is minimal to non-existent for practical purposes. It's going to happen how it's going to happen. And those are cases where, like, yes, thinking about other things might be more beneficial because there's nothing you can do about it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Although sometimes you can get yourself to not be as worried or anxious or whatever by exploring the thing.
Mm-hmm.
So something that will happen a lot is people will be like nervous about something and be like, I try not to think about it,
Mm-hmm.
which actually continues their nervousness or their anxiety. Because when you explore it, there are ways to explore it where it's like, oh, now that I think this through, actually, yeah, that's not likely, or even if it happens, it's not that big a deal or whatever. But you have to kind of explore it to get to those conclusions.
Do you think when people get to those conclusions, it reduces the likelihood that they'll have the same feeling of distress in the future, thinking about like the beginning of the rabbit hole?
Of that particular one, yeah.
Okay.
Meaning, like, if you and I were to talk about AI and explore it and get to a point, when I say like reach that conclusion, I don't just mean like say a thing to yourself that you don't believe. I mean like actually come to think, feel, believe something.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to talk about it and get to a point where you genuinely are like, oh yeah, okay, the thing I was worried about, I don't think is possible. Or the thing I was worried about, I think is very, very unlikely. And even if it were to happen, it's not that big a deal.
Mm-hmm.
Or the thing I'm worried about, I do think is very likely, but actually not that big of a problem if it happens. Like if you come to those conclusions, then you don't worry about the thing so much anymore.
I've noticed sometimes with myself that when I'm generally less stressed, I can resolve some of the rabbit holes and believe something different. And then if the thought comes up again, I'm like, oh, I figured that out. I believe something different. But then if I become more stressed, I'll get to the same negative conclusion from the end of the rabbit hole that I'm trying to finish this sentence.
So
Does that make sense?
it does. I'm aware of, like, in my personal experience, I love using it to craft marketing copy, referring to AI. Of course, I'm concerned about my image being co-opted often. I mean, I got all this. Ha ha ha. AI can be a real time saver. For example, you can use AI to scan your database and come up with conclusions. For scientists, that can be powerful. You still need to double check AI's work, but what a time saver. Sorry, I'm trying to take pauses to take deeper breaths. So a version of that for me is health anxiety. That
Mm-hmm.
like when I'm in a particular state of mind,
Mm-hmm.
something will happen, I'll feel some sensation and I'll start to worry about what this might mean, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in a different place, when I'm not as tired and feeling better,
Mm-hmm.
then I won't worry. I'll be like, I'm healthy. I'm, and I'll
With
remember
the same
that.
sensation, correct?
Well, see, that's the thing, is it
Oh.
can't ever be the same sensation.
That is such a good point.
So what I'm suggesting is that what you're talking about is not actually coming to a conclusion, or at least
Mhm.
not coming to a conclusion that is relevant to the next version of the rabbit. Like I can come to a conclusion that I am fine, and then the next day have a different sensation and be like, oh no, this one I might not be fine with.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that's not about coming to a conclusion that would impact the future ones. And sometimes it's just a coping mechanism, meaning sometimes it's like you think or feel or worry about a thing, and if you just like say stuff to yourself in your head, it calms you down and regulates you without actually being that you have internalized and actually come to that conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And that one, when it's that's another version of like when you're tired, even with similar or same experience. Well, now it's, I'm not in a place to be able to remember to utilize or have the ability, the resources necessary to utilize that coping mechanism in that way.
Do you think there's a way to figure out if you believe something or not?
That would be a conversation that requires talking about what we mean by believe.
Mhm.
Generally, I find it most useful to talk about things like that through the lens of how are you thinking, feeling, and acting. Like if you think, feel, and act in a way that would make the most sense if X were true, then functionally, I would say, then you believe X is true. You know, like
I love that so much.
if you believe that, all right, the first thing that popped in my head, but I'm not trying to take it in this direction. If you believe that there is an afterlife and that afterlife is split into like a good one and a bad one,
Yeah.
and that where you end up for eternity depends on your actions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then, if you were to believe that, you would theoretically act in accordance with those things, right? Like you would do the things that you believe get you to the good one or keep you out of the bad one, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So if you believe that and then don't behave in that way, then you're saying a thing that hasn't been internalized as like actually dictating how you think, feel, and act. That makes sense?
Yes, that is.
So
I'm so grateful for you.
A lot of what you're talking about is just saying words to yourself in your head.
Yeah.
Which can be helpful in certain contexts. But what I would say is you don't reach different conclusions in your own head. Right? Just as a general blanket rule, you can't get yourself to come to a new conclusion in your own head. You need new information to come to new conclusions. You can compose new arrangements of words and thoughts, like you can think things in the way that you could say them, but you can't actually get yourself to a place where like you're now behaving as though this new thing is true just by thinking in your head. You already did that. You came to your best conclusion. You can get new information that will take you to a new one. So talking about it with other people or doing things that get you information through like direct sensory experience can be helpful. Anyway, so a version of what you're talking about that I think is useful is like, thinking about this by myself is not helpful. So what do I want to think about or do or focus on instead? Can be a lot of things, but one that's often a good one is I want to talk to somebody else about the thing I'm thinking about, or I want to test some of these thoughts and see how they bear out in reality.
Could you give an example of testing? Or I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean. It doesn't have to be an example.
Well, like if you're saying in your head, if you're like, I'm really worried that I'm allergic to peanuts now because I've eaten them a long time, but then I ate some peanut butter the other day before I got really sick and I'm worried that might be an allergy to peanuts. I'm not suggesting that you do this thing, but an example of testing a thing would be like eat some peanut butter and monitor how things go, because that would give you new information. I'm really not suggesting that.
No, we're not suggesting it.
Unless you like go to the hospital and do it,
Yeah. Consult your doctor.
My question is, have you tried AI? I've tried some, yeah, and it is, I think, interesting and a useful tool. Science Versus just re-released their episode on heartbreak, and I thought it was interesting how they talked about basically your ex is associated in your brain with something positive. So your brain still releases the positive chemical response when you think of them, which is part of why someone might find themselves unable to stop thinking about their ex. Wow. Interesting. And then AI is still limited. More amateur and degreed linguists are being recruited for machine learning and time machine learning. So a couple different things in there.
Wow.
Here's my response to the thing about the thinking about the ex and whatever.
Yeah.
I don't think it matters. I would.
What part doesn't matter?
Whether or not something like that is true.
Oh, okay.
But it could be relevant to thought spiraling. Yeah, it absolutely could be. Whenever people persist in doing something that is resulting in the opposite of what they want, right? Like thinking about something in an effort to become happier, but actually thinking about it makes you sadder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or panicking every time I leave the house because I'm worried about having terrible things happen to me, but that ends up with me being stuck in my house and feeling like that's terrible, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whenever we all the time constantly do things that don't work out the way we would hope or actually cause the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
But when we persist in those things over and over, there's something, I refer to them as glitches, but I don't want to call it that now because I don't want to reinforce this idea that it's like a hardwired thing in the brain. But like
Yeah.
there's something that's being missed. There's some reason that strategy is being thought of and applied as though it is useful, even though the results show that it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So this conversation that you're referring to is people talking about a theory of why someone would continue to think about their ex, and it doesn't really so much matter in terms of like what would you do if this is true, this statement that your brain associates your ex with positive feelings and that's why you keep thinking about your ex.
Mm-hmm.
If that were true versus if that were not true, does it impact what you would do any differently? And I don't know that it does. I can see value in it in the way that a lot of these things are valuable, in that like if someone's like, what's wrong with me? Why do I keep thinking about my ex? Getting an explanation like that can be like, oh, okay, there's nothing wrong with me. That's why I'm doing it. And that can make things better. But in terms of what you do, what do you do? I don't find that to be a very, presumably in this context, the point of what we're talking about, someone can't stop thinking about their ex, is that as they're thinking about their ex, they are not happy. They are not feeling positive things.
Oh, fascinating.
Right? Like if they if thinking about your ex makes you very happy, then okay, great. Keep thinking about your ex. Like, what's the problem here? But if thinking about your ex makes you sad, then it's a problem that we'd want to look at. And so to me, it rings hollow to say, well, your brain associates it with positive feelings and therefore releases chemicals that make you feel positive when your actual lived experience is not feeling positive.
That would kind of make me feel awful too. Your self-report is this feels bad, and then someone was like, well, actually.
Yeah, well, that's the downside of whenever we're giving explanations as an attempt to be like, hey, there's nothing wrong with you. It's totally normal. Stop worrying about that element. Just address what's happening. Don't worry that it's a symptom of some larger problem. Mm-hmm. The downside of that is that whenever we do that and someone dealing with that issue finds that explanation to not be applicable to them, the problem just got worse for them. Because they're already at a point theoretically where they're saying, what's wrong with me that I'm experiencing this? Mm-hmm. Now we've said, this is why people experience this, but it doesn't apply to me, which reinforces like, okay, so what is wrong with me? Because it's not the normal thing. It reinforces the idea that there's something wrong with me.
Yeah.
To me, this rests on like a very common premise in our culture that I find to be really problematic, which we could call biological essentialism or whatever. But basically the idea that you feel what you feel because of chemicals which are released in your brain, which is not true, and no one would claim that it is true. We can say that you feel what you feel, like feeling something correlates with chemicals being present in the brain, but describing it as a directional causation, that the chemicals are released and then therefore you feel a certain thing, cannot be true. It can't be, because how would the brain release those chemicals, right? Like there are things that I find enjoyable that not everybody finds enjoyable, right? Mm-hmm. How did my brain come to a point where it releases enjoyable chemicals in response to doing that thing if there was no prior thing which prompted the release of the chemicals?
Yeah.
People they talked to did mention knowing the reason was helpful. They talked about ways to get over your ex at the end of the episode, and suggestions were things like reminding yourself about ways they weren't so great, avoiding triggers. I like that they took it in that direction. And one of the like fundamental flaws with most things that we would talk about is like self-help is that the premise is that there's something you can do all by yourself to make this stuff better. And that is sometimes true. If it was never true, we wouldn't be doing this at all, right?
Yeah.
It is sometimes true that in response to new experiences, new information, whatever, you now come to a new conclusion, and what you do moving forward is different.
Mm-hmm.
The issue, I think, one of the issues is, again, ascribing causality where it doesn't exist. Meaning, if listening to that podcast, if before listening to that podcast, you're thinking about your ex a lot and experiencing what you would define as having a hard time moving off, moving past them or whatever, getting over them,
Mm-hmm.
then you listen to the podcast, and then afterwards your experience is different in a way that you would say, I'm having a lot more success getting over my ex, right?
Mm-hmm.
It could be true that after that podcast, after listening to that podcast, you are now doing things like reminding yourself about ways they weren't great,
Mm-hmm.
at the same time that you are also feeling better.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm not even saying, it could be that doing that thing does cause you to feel better,
Mm-hmm.
but what caused you to do that thing is listening to the podcast, right? Getting information from somebody else changed you in some way so that now you are a person who, theoretically in this example, reminds themselves about the crap stuff their ex did and therefore feels better about it.
Mm-hmm.
But when we get rid of that part, we don't count that part, right? We're just like, oh, I heard about this idea, not these people impacted me or being exposed to this, like they changed me by sharing this with me.
Yeah.
But I learned this thing, and now I do something, this unspoken idea that like I am different now because I chose to do a new thing that I heard about.
Mm-hmm.
It still reinforces this idea, like you were just talking about, that you can be all by yourself, all alone, just thinking about stuff, and it can get better, when generally that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I spent a lot of time growing up, frustrated with how none of the advice out there seemed to apply to me. Yeah, that's, especially for people who identify as neurodivergent, a very common and important experience, and part of why I try to be so clear about not stating things in a way that's like, this is why people X, because that can never be true.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do try to point out, even when, and it can be frustrating for people, that even when someone's like, I learned this thing or do this thing and it's helpful to me,
Mm-hmm.
in a forum like this where it's a lot of, or theoretically at least the potential of multiple people watching it and whatever,
Yeah.
I still try to say, that's great. It can be useful in this way or for this reason or whatever. And it's not actually literally true that X caused Y here,
Mm-hmm.
so that the people who aren't talking, but what will sometimes happen then is the person who put it out there as this thing, I do this thing and it helps me, will hear me responding in that way and think what I'm saying is that they shouldn't do that thing anymore.
Ooh.
Which is not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say I'm glad, and I'm being very precise about not applying ideas and experiences more broadly than we have reason to,
Mm-hmm.
because it can cause problems for others, not the person who said that it works for them.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what I used to give caveats all the time about, I'm not trying to take anything away from anybody, that if it works, it works. Like, it doesn't matter whether
Mm-hmm.
I or anyone else would think it should work or is accurate or isn't or whatever. If it impacts you. Another thing I like to share with people, there's no such thing as the placebo effect for an individual case.
Mm-hmm.
The placebo effect is specifically a concept that it was developed for and is utilized only for large-scale statistical research.
Mm-hmm.
If a person does a thing and then some change happens,
Mm-hmm.
not just once, they do it again and that change happens again, they do it again, that change happens again, then that thing correlates with the change that happens. If we're saying that's just a placebo effect, what we're really saying is, well, that wouldn't work for anybody else. It might work for you.
Or sometimes I feel like the insinuation is for people who are dumb enough to believe that that helps them, they're still in the same bucket as you.
Right.
They're also like,
Well, that's
ooh.
part of the problem with, like we talked about, when something
Yeah.
means multiple things.
Mm-hmm.
someone can say it meaning this thing, but it gets interpreted meaning this other thing.
Mhm.
So placebo effect can be used to mean like you're lying, what you're experiencing isn't real, it's fake, it's all in your head,
Mhm.
like that's not actually happening, whatever. But a lot of another thing it can be used to mean, and this is what it is used to explore in like clinical trials. The whole reason it is a thing is to project scalability. Like
Yeah.
if you do X and it results in Y consistently, like it's a pattern, it's reliable,
Mhm.
then doing X results in Y. The mechanism of that is unimportant for an individual.
Mhm.
Like, is it because it makes you think that Y will happen and then your brain does stuff that makes Y happen? Who cares?
Yeah.
That still has that impact.
Mhm.
The only reason we would care about something like that is because if that's the case, if somehow this isn't about the actual non-conscious interaction of the thing with your body, but is filtered through consciousness and that's why it impacts you in that way, then we cannot reliably predict that it would affect other people in that same way.
Yeah.
Because their conscious stuff is different. That's the only reason it exists. So mostly at this point, placebo, people will say like, I do this thing and I don't know if it's placebo effect, but it helps me. It's not placebo effect because that's not a thing that happens in an individual case. I do this thing and it helps me needs no intervening thing.
Mhm.
The only reason to put that there is an anticipation that other people might say, that's placebo effect, that's not real. And you're like, I understand it might be.
Yeah.
But anybody who's saying to that also doesn't know what they're talking about and is just being pedantic. It can be relevant if like someone's saying, I do this and it helps me.
Mhm.
And if I think that's only because of, or in large part due to how it's filtered through their consciousness and their expectations, then I would say like, well, I'm not going to do that because I don't have that same expectation and therefore I don't think it'll work for me.
Mhm.
But again, that if you're talking about placebo effect, that doesn't tend to come across as, I'm glad that works for you, I don't know that it would work for me. It tends to come across as, you're making this up, you're doing it wrong, that's fake, it's not real.
Mhm.
Causality in individual circumstances is unknowable.
Yeah.
Like, we don't know why. Take any individual specific thing and say, why did this happen or why did this happen in that way? That question cannot be answered definitively. We can identify variables which impacted it logically or theoretically or whatever, but we can't list them all and we can't say exactly what element, it's not the part that generally matters.
I think unfortunately too, sometimes statements like that are translated as Brandon doesn't ever think I'll not feel depressed all the time or things like that. Like
Statements like what?
What you just said about causality.
Oh, I see what you're saying. And if it's getting, so the statement I'm making cannot literally be interpreted to mean that. It can be interpreted and then added to other thoughts to derive the conclusion.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Right. That in essence, if somebody is saying that or thinking that I'm saying that, what they're assuming is that in order to not feel depressed, I have to be able to say why I am depressed. And people do sometimes think that. Frequently, actually, people will think that. I would actually say that having the belief that in order to stop feeling depressed, I have to understand why I feel depressed, having that belief is a major variable that would impact someone and cause them to feel depressed.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
But yeah, that when people say things like that, that's why I'm so precise with the language. Like, okay, that can't be an interpretation of what I said.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a conclusion drawn from what was interpreted of what I said, added on to some other things that you're thinking or maybe assuming that I'm thinking.
Yeah.
But no, actually, it's a very liberating and helpful idea.
I think it's really liberating.
Is to say, because it's impossible to know why, but we do know that people change, including the individual who is saying in this hypothetical, like, I am depressed. Like, one of the things that I'll say is, no matter how depressed a person is, and no matter how much of that is due to biological, unchangeable things outside of biological intervention, To whatever extent it doesn't, I don't have to figure out to whatever extent that is true, because hey, we can't figure out why. But because I can say that even that person has moments, experiences where they are more depressed or less depressed. It is not static.
Yeah.
So this idea that my experience is due only and solely to so those are separate things. The idea that that experience is due solely to internal factors, whether that's my brain or my psychology, but just stuff in me, and has nothing to do with anything outside of me, it can't be true. Or if it is true, then whatever those things that are internal to you are things which change.
Yeah.
Because your experience changes. Your experience only doesn't change if you zoom out and are being abstract and academic about it. Like people will say, I'm always tired, which I believe. If we create a scale of 100 being fully rested and 0 being fully tired, yeah, I'm never at 100. I'm always at least 1 point tired. But there's a big difference between 99 and 20. And so can I describe that and think of it as I'm always tired? And would that statement be accurate? Yes. But then people take that and project that into the future. I'm always tired. That means I will always be tired. And they lose hope and they despair about things. Because when you're projecting into the future, you're not saying sometimes I'll be less and sometimes I'll be more. You're only at that point applying the language as being tired is awful. And it's always going to be awful. So it's not to like change what someone's saying about their own report. I can't and I wouldn't. Like people know themselves. But the question that matters in individual cases, big part of this is just research is not meant. Research has never been meant. It is not structured in any way as an attempt to give individual advice in individual circumstances. That's the whole, literally the point of research. If anyone did research and said, we've looked at this one thing in the context in which it happened, then everyone would say, well, then your recommendations have no bearing on anything else. Like that's a too small of a sample size. The point is, it's statistical. We're not saying what will happen in an individual case. We're saying when you look at enough data points, you start to see a trend. And it's useful to know these trends. But the most thoroughly researched and most effective treatments are still not 100% effective. No one is making the claim that we can use research to determine exactly what should or will happen in individual circumstances. But it does get put out there and talked about as though it becomes relevant. That's part of why I don't like things like what that podcast was doing. It reinforces this premise that if you learn enough research, it will tell you what you should do in your life and then you won't be unhappy anymore. Well, okay, that's not the premise. That's a conclusion of the underlying premise it reinforces, which is that research can tell us why things happen. It can't. Research tells us what happens, not why they happen. So in individual circumstance, what matters is what's worth trying next. If something is different than I would want it to be, I'm trying to come up with things to do to make it better, make it more like what I wanted. The only question that matters is what's worth trying next. However I answer that question is valid. And one very useful and common way of answering that question is to then ask a second question, say, well, why do I think it's happening the way it's happening? Because if I can identify some ideas there, then that would clarify. Like if I think I'm feeling like this because of that medicine I took, then if I want to change how I'm feeling, what's worth trying next is don't take that medicine. So it's a very useful question to the extent that it's in service of answering the real one, which is what's worth trying next. But people get lost in the sauce and think that it's about identifying the accurate answer of why is this happening, which is unknowable and doesn't matter if it isn't applied to anything. So I'm trying to encourage people to pay attention. And our culture does tend to teach people that your own experiences matter less than the experiences of other people in similar circumstances. That's one of the premises that this idea, this way of using research relies on is, well, I struggle with this thing and I tried this and it didn't work, but the research says doing that will work,
Mm-hmm.
then says like, oh, there's something wrong with me. I didn't do it right because it should
Mhm.
work, which isn't what it's saying. Anyway,
I appreciate you so much, Brandon.
well, thank you. I appreciate you. There's so much value to thinking about things. There's a reason that we do it and have been incentivized to do it and have built everything in our society around like maximizing the opportunity for people to think about stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times where it's not useful and actually makes things worse.
Mm-hmm.
Like people talk about fight or flight all the time or prefrontal cortex shutdown. Why does that mechanism exist? Because the reality is that sometimes thinking about stuff not only doesn't help, actually makes it worse.
Mm-hmm.
We would not have a biological mechanism that inhibits our ability to think
Mm-hmm.
unless there were some times where cutting off our ability to think is actually the better option.
But I feel like there's some irony in that those are the moments when we're theoretically saving our lives and we're talking about improving depression. I don't know.
Well, that's part of the issue is that those experiences are, that mechanism is built to cut off thinking and enhance physical activity, right?
Mhm.
It has its costs. You pay the cost
Oh
later.
yeah, I'm not trying to.
But that's the idea, right? Is that there are some times where like just taking action and not thinking is the best thing you can do.
Mhm.
Where it becomes a really huge problem for people all over the place now is when we don't have time for the whole thing, but humans can make ourselves treat X as though it is the same as Y by coming to
Yeah.
think that they're basically the same thing through whatever certain processes. So when we start to treat a cognitive task as though it is life or death, because cognitive tasks, by definition, by this strict definition of how fight or flight works, cognitive tasks are not, ever, cannot be life or death.
Yeah.
Something that exists only in the cognitive realm cannot literally kill you.
Mhm.
It can lead to things or cause you to miss things or do things, or it can end up putting you in a position in which you die.
Yeah.
So it's not that I'm not saying they're not important. I'm saying they are not immediately fatal or they wouldn't be a cognitive thing.
Mm-hmm.
But we can get ourselves to a place where we respond to cognitive things as though they are literal environmental, potentially fatal dangers. And the response to that puts us in a position where we're worse at thinking and better at acting. So better at like taking action, I mean, not acting on stage. And so those problems then like,
Are we acting right now, Brandon?
I would say no, but others might say yes. Those problems then persist and get worse because you get worse and worse at thinking the more panicked you get.
Mm-hmm.
But you're trying to solve a thinking-oriented problem. So yeah, part of what I'm doing is to try and help people to differentiate that a thing which exists in cognition is important and can lead to all kinds of things, but is
Mhm.
not the same as something which exists in the physical environment for that specific reason. Because if you believe that it is, your body responds to it as though it is, which is unhelpful. It's been an act this whole time. Briefly, here are my thoughts on AI. I think mostly what people are talking about.
You now have to go A through I. You have to.
That would be funny. I think that mostly what people are discussing right now when they're discussing AI is really they're just talking about a particular fad of, which doesn't mean unhelpful or unimportant, but a particular fad of tech tools that are being created and released to the public.
Mm-hmm.
In that sense, I don't find it any fundamentally different from when the blockchain was first developed and led to like a bunch of cryptocurrencies.
Mm-hmm.
So it will impact society in the same way that like any rush of a new type of businesses and tools being created and put forward impacts society.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem a lot, as I would often say, is like the language is muddy here, where people are talking about AI and what they're really talking about is like ChatGPT or, you know, the fact that things can make art with a written prompt, turn it into a visual image and whatever, which are useful and interesting tools. And like all tools, the impact they have is a result of how they are being used, not the existence itself of the tool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But AI is a phrase and a concept that people have associated, especially through like mass media, with a larger idea of like a non-biological entity which matches or exceeds our cognitive capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And those stories run in all kinds of directions. So what's really happening is like you gave somebody a tool that can turn a language prompt into a visual image or various other versions of this. And then they're like, oh no, this is like that story where robots killed all the humans.
Mm-hmm.
And it's two completely different things. It'd be like giving somebody a plant and they'd be like, oh no, this is like all those ruins where all the buildings are overgrown and these plants are going to take over everything. We're making connections. The current crop of AI is based on what are called LLMs, language learning models, where they're fed training data, which is written like all the current AI stuff that we're talking about is all based around written language.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's what they are, language learning models. They're fed training data that's written language, and they establish patterns and commonalities and preferences and whatever, things like, and it's incredibly complex. I couldn't begin to describe the specific details, but to overly simplify, it's things like when someone writes the word doting, it is followed by the word daughter or father like 95% of the time. So then when it generates output, in any case where it uses doting, 95% of the time it's going to put daughter or father right after that. Right? Way oversimplified. Obviously, it's way more complex than that, but that's the basic idea.
That doesn't seem very scary.
Well, it's not, to me anyway. It's just a tool.
Oh yes, it could be to something.
You could, yeah.
It doesn't seem very scary to me in this moment with the information I currently am consciously aware of.
Humans have been developing technology, tools, for an incredibly long time.
Fire!
Sure.
Stones!
And all technology, every tool we develop, is something which exists outside of humans, but either matches something that we can do or increases our capacity to do something. You know, that with a hammer, you can apply more force to a smaller surface area more efficiently than you can with your bare hand, right?
Yeah.
It's not fundamentally something we can't do, but it's way more effective and efficient, but also way more constrained. That's the trade-off.
Yeah.
Tools are specialized because biology can do the same thing, right? Like there are species which can evolve, like have evolved to be able to apply a lot of force over a very small surface area, but being built in such a way, structured in such a way as to do that requires that you're structured in that way. When it's a tool, we just put down the tool and pick up a different tool. But if our species evolved to be that good at that thing, it would require other limitations in other ways, right? So that's all. And historically, with some notable exceptions, for the most part, the tools that we have developed as a species are things which match or enhance our physical capabilities. What things that our bodies do, not our minds.
Yeah.
The written word and stuff like that is when I'm saying that there's exceptions. There's language is technology. Written things are technology. Has enhanced that. But effectively what's scaring everybody right now is that this new batch of tools replicates things that we identify as cognitively oriented tasks. Writing an email is something I think of as a thinking task.
Yeah.
And now we have a tool that can do that. And so everyone's freaking out in the same way that everyone used to freak out about like, if this tool can do the thing that I've spent my whole life focused on doing, then what the hell am I going to do? But what happens societally, like individuals lose their jobs and it causes problems or whatever. But societally used to be 90% of the populace was on agriculture and now it's like 5% and the rest of us moved into thinking tasks. But now we're saying, oh, well, if tools can do thinking tasks, then what will we move on to? Nothing. There will be nothing left. But I don't think anyone would argue that humans only can physically act with their body or think things. Everyone would talk about like feeling as an example, which these things don't do. B, even if they did, so what? What's the worst case scenario here? Is a post scarcity future where like tools take care of everything and nobody has to work? Like we're talking about what if in our society as it's currently structured, all of a sudden nobody could get jobs? That would be really bad because our society is structured around everyone getting jobs.
Yeah.
But if our world was one where there was nothing that humans did that was uniquely valuable over technology doing that same thing, then I think things would just shift to the point of like, well, then we don't need to structure our society in the way that it's structured
Yeah.
for everyone to do these things.
Yeah.
In the same way, this isn't too like outlandish. If you talk to somebody 200 years ago and was like, hey, 200 years from now, 95% of the people working on agriculture won't be needed in agriculture, they would have been like, oh my God, what will we even do?
Yeah, even like it might be the end of the world.
So you just figure it out, right? Like, I'm not worried about it. And anything there is longer term. And yes, there's a bunch of stuff that you can't do without blah, 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 blah. The other concern that everyone has where like, what if these things are basically just become us, but better? Isn't possible because we are biological entities and they are not. Like, as a biological entity, you have direct access to information from your environment, not mediated through language. You see, you take sound waves and photons and pheromones and and translate it into data that machines don't do. So they can't be human. This is a result of people overemphasizing how much of me is my cognition. So something which mimics my cognition well scares me because it's like, that's me. No, you have a body. It doesn't have a body. Like, if nothing else, part of the thing that freaks people out is the idea of like, well, they wouldn't need to eat and whatever. Yeah, but that's part of the point of why they can't replicate or be what we are. Like, everything in your body is organized around dealing with physical things, including even your cognition, right? Like, in some ways, it's like how stories have explored immortality. If you remove everything about survival and death, then what happens to a person? There's stories about exploring cognition independent, like cognition separated from physicality, similar to like spirits and heaven and afterlives. And it's interesting stuff to think about, but it's not new stuff. Another thought is, I think these things are a lot more like what we are than people. All that stuff leads people to being very afraid of the idea that these things mimic our cognitive capacity. So then people will say things like, they're not thinking, they're just repeating language that they've been fed. My thought on that is that's what humans do. Like, they don't do it in the same way we do, but in the realm of how we use language, they're doing the same thing humans do. We just take in language and then run it through some algorithms and then use it and test it and it gets refined and whatever. There are obviously some specific differences, but that fundamental piece, that's what cognition is to me, is taking in language, associating it with meaning, utilizing it, whatever. But the associating it with meaning part is just a theory. That's not like a mechanism that we can observe. What we observe is we take in language and we put out language. For thousands of years, we have explored ideas of how we take in language and why we then utilize it in certain ways. But I don't think it's fundamentally different than what LLMs are doing. Different specifics, but fundamentally the same thing. And here's the thing that always to me is the most reassuring. It's the same as like when people worry about, well, what if aliens came and tried to conquer our planet, whatever. These stories that we as humans tell are projections of our thoughts about humans onto non-human entities. In other words, ain't no AI ever done anything in the realm of taking over the world, but we've told a lot of stories about it.
Oh, yeah.
And those stories are written by humans who are exploring human motivations. We write stories about aliens conquering our world for resources because that is a thing that we do or have done or can't, in that particular case, it's a thing we do and have done. But sometimes we write stories about aliens through the lens of like, what would we do, or what would versions of us do in a certain capacity, whatever. It has nothing to do with whatever theoretically might exist or might not. It's purely about, it's no different than what we used to do of like, not used to, still do, of what we do when we're like, those other kinds of people are going to try and destroy us all. We're just subbing in non-human things for that. This is a purely narrative thing. Logically speaking, it makes no sense. Take the alien thing, for example, right? Like, if theoretically there was an alien species that managed to somehow navigate, like traveling from interstellar distances to our planet, but somehow they need the resources of our planet, and they can't like figure out sustainable ways to work with us to get that, like they've learned to travel the whole galaxy, but they need our stuff specifically, and they're not going to share it or teach us any new or better way. Like, how did they get here if they could not figure out how to be more resource efficient than that? Also, I don't know, I'm off on things now. Also, is it true that there are humans who delight in causing harm to other humans? Theoretically, right? Like, I don't really know and interact with anybody like that, but I've heard lots of stories that I believe information has been shared with me from sources I trust that people are like that some people hurt other people. Generally, are those people involved in our like space program? No. Because inherently doing anything that is inherently difficult, which space travel would be for any life form that evolved on like a planet, they're not evolved for space. So learning how to do that would be very difficult. Difficult things require a lot of communication and collaboration.
Yeah.
And so people or aliens, whatever, any individual who's like, nah, it's all about me and screw everybody else, I'm going to hurt everybody to get what I can get, they don't do those difficult things. Like, again, there are narratives framed around a lot of this, but generally speaking, if we look at the life of a person who like kills people, it's not so great for, like their life doesn't go so well compared to people who don't kill people. So even if theoretically there's like genocidal alien figures, like those ones are not likely to be involved in like
the ones on the ship.
Like if we discovered an alien planet with life on it and we decided to send some stuff over there, would we be like, send all the generals to just blow them all up? No, we would. I mean, there are organizations dedicated to exploring these things. People. We'd be like, let's figure out how to because an inherent thing of biological life is the desire for survival. Like we're labeling it as a desire for survival, a fear of in encountering something new and unknown. For anything that is alive and can die, there would theoretically always be some hesitation of like, I don't know what's going on over here. Let's be really careful.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of these alien stories, what's the invasion from Mars or whatever one that was broadcast on the radio and people thought was real? And the whole point is like their technology is vastly superior and they destroy us and whatever, but then they die from a germ 2 months later or whatever. So we're speculating about a species that has mastered interstellar travel and technology, but is unaware of the possibility of germs killing them. They have a biology which is susceptible to germs, but have no awareness of the fact that there might be germs that could. It's all just stories we're telling. So when it comes, generally speaking, humans don't want to control and destroy all other humans.
Yeah.
So if there was to be any synthetic thing which was able to mimic, match, exceed the capacity, generally speaking, people who think even more are less inclined to hurting other people. So we're speculating about things which could think better than we think, but would reach much worse conclusions than we reach. The only way that works is in narratives where we're like, oh, they made this one mistake of they're trying to protect all humans, and they realize the only way to protect humans from harm is to eliminate all humans. Like, that's just a narrative linguistic like device that makes no sense in reality, that something which is genuinely trying to follow its programming of protect humans reaches the conclusion that killing all humans meets that goal. It's nonsense. See, when we can get new conclusions by interacting with other people,
Yeah.
it actually
I
does.
was just thinking we could have like a database with Brandon's peaceful arguments as to why everything's gonna be okay, and you type in like end
The
of
only way to
world.
save humanity is destroy. Oh, I missed some comments. I gotta get going, but I'll read them afterwards. Yeah, just generally, the only thing that humans are better at than all other biological organisms is communication.
Mhm.
We can theorize about being better about cognition, but the only way we're measuring that is by the way that we relay information to one another.
Mhm.
Like how else, what other metric would you use to say cognition? We're talking about communication. And that's the point of that, is that our species has evolved that our best survival mechanism is collaboration, to work with other members of our species.
Mhm.
So we've gotten really, really good at that.
Mhm.
I don't think there's any logical way to speculate about a cognitive entity, a thinking thing, which does not inherently desire to communicate and collaborate with other thinking things. That's the only purpose of thinking.
So the alien comes and we save the whole universe
Sure.
because we get along so well.
Now I could reinstate some of your fears, because there's other possibilities of entities that don't need technology to travel through space,
That sounds cool. They'd be my friend too.
and they could be any kind of a thing. But again, logically, if there's not a lot of life in the universe,
Oh
then why
no,
do they
don't
need
say
our
that out
specific
loud.
I mean, logically, to me, it's just, this is a helpful exercise.
What do you mean by a lot, Brandon Testers?
Meaning we have not observed any of it, and we've looked.
I would
We
love
can only look at a very narrow slice,
Just
but
figure out-
the closer in physical proximity and chronological proximity, the more we can look. So to whatever extent stuff exists, either it's stuff we can observe, or it's far away from us, either in time or space, or both.
Mhm.
There's other stuff that's way more worth existential fears than some outside entity killing us all.
I don't need to hear those today.
Well, this is what I'm saying. This is, to me, a helpful exercise that we talk about often, of reminding
Mhm.
people the difference between what your thoughts are and what reality is, regardless of whether your thoughts might or might not be accurate predictors or describers of reality.
yeah.
They are separate things.
Mhm.
And everybody's fears are about stories that we are making up.
Mhm.
No one's fears about AI or aliens or any of these things is based on any actual real experience.
Mhm.
I guess I shouldn't say no one, because some people say, that they have experienced and interacted with aliens, and it could be based on that. But
Yeah.
I'm talking about generally what's generally accepted and thought of, we're just saying, what if these stories that humans made up and told and are very popular, as all stories are popular in large part because of the fact that they are so different from what actually happens in real life.
Mhm.
So stories that we've made up that are specifically unlike real life.
Mhm.
And then we're going to say that's what real life is like. We're just telling ghost stories to each other and getting scared about it.
Let's tell fairy stories and get happy.
They both serve a purpose. Anyway, I got to go. I'm running real late. Thank you.
It was nice
Sorry I
to be
missed those
with you all.
comments. Good to be with you. See you
Yes.
next week.
See you next week.
Bye.